Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which formed part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 4th of the 9 and is a conversation between Andrew Taylor, Shelly Rouse, Mike Kiely and Adele Morris about modernising planning committees. Andrew is Group Planning Director at Vistry. Shelly is a Principal Consultant at the Planning Advisory Service. Mike is Chair of the Planning Officers Society. And Adele is a Planning Committee Trainer and former councillor. Their conversation takes in the proposed national scheme of delegation, training for committee members, and the case for online council meetings. Enjoy.
Committees, big focus of government in terms of speeding up or modernising planning. We've had a case for government setting out the background for the modernisation. So not necessarily saying I agree with all this stuff, but anyway, this is what government are saying. Committees are unpredictable. It's a meeting at the end of a long and costly process, but it's also an important and integral part of our planning and political system. So it's long been a concern raised by government, applicants, and indeed officers and some councillors about the amount of applications going to committee, the type of applications being reported, and in some cases the consistency or otherwise of the decision-making process. And all those things have been part of, I suppose, the government's thinking to get to this stage. This isn't the first time that committees have been looked at, though. Many efforts over many years to improve committee processes. I know when I've been in charge of committees in the past, there's a big focus on training, a big process focus on improving delegation or increasing delegation. And I've been involved in LGA, Local Government Association, peer reviews of committees in the past, and again, looking at trying to improve best practice. So we had a planning reform working paper on planning committees in December 2024, which set out 5 key issues, which they've sort of now come through and sort of picked up in the planning and infrastructure bill. So a clarity of decision-making route being an important point. A consideration that too much committee time is spent on small applications and those on allocated sites. Overturning of officers' advice, and possibly Adele may have a comment on that. Poor committee member understanding and inability to make decisions in line with planning principles and the law. Lots to discuss in that one. And a lack of transparency of committee decisions and their consequences. So that's sort of the government case for changes to planning committees. Shelly, PAS have done a lot of work recently in terms of looking at committees and trying to do a bit of a study, trying to take the temperature across the country. What have you been finding out?
Yeah, so I think quite serendipitously, at the same time as the working paper came out on modernising planning committee, we were already thinking at PAS HQ, how can we find out sort of how things are working in the world? Can we get a bit of a kind of national benchmark? So we ran a survey where we asked either heads of planning or officers or chairs of planning committee, so we engaged with both officers and members to tell us about how their planning committees were operating. We ran it for 2 months, so from October to end of December last year, and the results have finally sort of been analysed, digested, and have come out this week. Some really interesting stuff. So we had about 125 respondents, so nearly a third, between a third and a half of all councils kind of told us how things were operating. And some of the real key findings were around the sort of format and structure of the committees. So about 2/3, so 75% of respondents have a single committee that meets once a month, that has 9 to 12 members, that has an agenda item of about 3 to 4 items and lasts for about 3 hours with a delegation rate of over 90%. So that feels quite standard. That feels quite a, kind of industry benchmark. If 75 to, 2/3 of people are doing it. We did find some outliers though. So about 3% of authorities who responded have planning committees with over 15 members sitting on them, and agenda items of more than 5 items, and have meetings that tend to last over 4 hours. So some real kind of outliers in terms of how that structure and performance is happening. We also asked some questions around training. So we asked whether training is mandatory in those councils, and whether it's a kind of requirement to sit on planning committee. Most, I think over 80% of councils have that model. So 100% of councils offer training, 80% require that to be mandatory before sitting on planning committee. Interestingly, we then asked the officers and members as a collective, do you think that's kind of given you the skills and experience to be effective decision makers? And that was slightly more a mixed bag. So around 17% said yes, but all the rest were kind of no, don't know, maybe. So I think what's happening in that training space maybe is something for an area of focus for us all kind of collectively going forward.
That's really interesting. Was the study able to differentiate between officer and councillor responses, or was it a response on behalf of the council?
So as the results are presented in the website and the resources, it's a merged level of response, but we have got the ability to disaggregate between officer and member responses. There was so much consistency though between those officer and member perspectives. It was worth bringing it out as a kind of collective results across the board.
Well, it's good that I suppose there was a consistency of comment from both sets of people. So lots of different bits in there. We're going to try and talk about delegation. We're going to try and talk about strategic committees, mandatory training, trust between members and officers, all that sort of stuff, and then online committees at the end. Mike, can we come to you, sort of national scheme of delegation from a previous chief officer and also from a planning officer society view? I mean, what's the benefit or otherwise of a national scheme?
Well, I think as Shelley has outlined, the problem isn't as widespread as perhaps the narrative from government is suggesting. So and let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think if we are going down that route in order to deal with some of the outliers, perhaps I just offer a few observations. What I would say is what we mustn't have as criteria is the number of objections. The number of objections is completely and utterly irrelevant. It's not a referendum. It doesn't matter how many times something has been repeated. If it's good, it only has to be said once. If it's bad, saying it 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times doesn't make it any better. So please don't have that, because we need to stop people putting in thousands and thousands of objections, thinking it will make a difference. We have to process them. And we have to read each one just in case it says something slightly different. So that's my first plea. And can government please say that the number of objections is not a material planning consideration. So you're wasting your time drumming it up, or in some cases forging it, as we've seen recently in the press. The second is the issue of a departure. Departure isn't really defined. Article 15 requires you to advertise a scheme that doesn't conform with the provisions of the development plan. At one level, hardly any applications, and particularly big applications, comply 100% with the development plan. It's more nuanced than that. So at the moment, whether it's a departure or not doesn't really matter, because it only goes to whether it's advertised or not. If it's the criteria by which it goes to planning committee, it will matter, and we'll have JR after JR after JR. So please, we can't have that as a criteria. The other thing I would urge government, and I've not seen that they pick this up, is not just about determining planning applications. It's entered into Section 106 agreements. They're dealing with trees, enforcement, prior notification, non-material amendments, listed buildings, etc. So they need to be clear what is delegated and what is not. In most authorities, most of those things are delegated most, if not all of the time. So it's really important that those trailing wires aren't left, because anything that requires a Section 106 agreement, if it's not specifically delegated to the officers to enter into that agreement, no matter how small the scheme, off it goes to committee merely because you have to enter into a 106 agreement. So the gist of our recommendation is that it should be clear that it is only applications for planning permission, and that phrase has a legal meaning. Applications for planning permission can go to committee, and we would say when the recommendation is for approval. If it's being refused, the applicant has the right of appeal, so there's no need to put those to committee. I think the criteria, and government are going down this line, they should only be strategic applications, and how you define that is open for debate, but they're sort of pitching it between 10 and 100. I mean, we've suggested the strategic definition that operates in London for the mayor is a good model that you could, because it's not just about housing, it's about all sorts of other things as well. So there's a good model there that can be used elsewhere. I think it would only go to committee where there are bona fide planning objections. Doesn't matter how many, but if there's a proper objection that raises material planning consideration is in response to the scheme, then it should be considered. And the final criteria is that the chair considers that there is a material planning reason for putting that to committee, and that you can't specifically define it, but you can set out sort of criteria. So it raises issues of a strategic nature. Complex development plan policy issues are raised. Other issues of a complex nature, or matters that are not of a minor nature and are likely to cause significant harm. So you've got the chair with the chief planner acting as a gatekeeper to only put to committee things that need a committee decision because of the issues that they raise. So that's what we're suggesting, and there must be no call-ins. I think that needs to be very, very clear, because if someone calls it in, then you've got a problem. When do they do that? Do they do it just in the consultation phase? If they call it in, are they immediately biased, etc., because that can undermine the whole process. And finally, it is important that the chief planning officer must be able not to use their delegation if they feel that that there's an unintended issue that needs to go to committee. So that's quite important, and I think that's a principle of any delegation, that the person who has that delegated authority doesn't have to use it if they feel it's not appropriate within the particular circumstance.
Mike, thanks very much for that. Loads and loads of different things in there. Some will unpack, but Adele, a politician, a councillor view or ex-councillor view on this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, because I do the training as well, I have seen some fairly bonkers schemes of delegation, where anybody can call something in, and it goes automatically to committee. So it's fair to say there are some. I think, unfortunately, this is basically taking a hammer to crack a nut, because I think there are actually not that many of them. I'm disappointed at the idea of having a national scheme of delegation, because local authorities are all different. They're the way they operate, and that is what the structure allows. That's what the system allows. We have a political system. Like it or not, politics is involved in planning, not obviously in when the planning committee are making their decision, because they have to be completely non-political at that point. But all of the issues around planning that happen around the committee are very much political, and so that's the first point that I would make. In terms of what what the criteria should be set up. Well, I think this is the thing. You can't really say everybody has to do it like this. Interestingly, PAS has got some guidance for all sorts of different ways that they as you know, do good practice guides. So there are all kinds of different ways that authorities currently do their schemes of delegation, and there are recommendations and advice about which the pros and cons of each of those, and a lot of them work quite effectively. I think there are times when they don't work effectively. I think delays, obviously, the biggest one being that any things being brought to committee causes delays for the developers. And can I just add, a lot of this as well is driven by the developers. So I had a look at the bill yesterday and I had a look at the press release yesterday, and all the comments that are positively, yeah, this is all great, were all from developers. There was no local authority saying, yeah, we really like this. There were no councillors saying, yeah, we really like this. There were no community organisations saying, yeah, we really like this. So it's all being driven by developers. Now, planning committees do need to be sorted out. I have seen some terrible, terrible planning committees and some very bad decisions. But they exist. There is a political system that we have in this country for deciding planning applications, and like it or not, and they might sometimes come to a different view from that the officer has come to. And let's be honest, if something has come to planning committee, with the exception of these slightly bonkers ones with a scheme of delegation where anybody can refer it, if it's not policy compliant, and mostly they're not policy compliant, the planning committee is able to make a different decision if it is a fair and balanced decision. And guess what? Planning committees sometimes overturn officer recommendations and they win at appeal. Shock horror. So, I just really hate all this narrative around planning, actually. And it's not just about planning committees. There's always someone having a go at the members, they're having a go at the NIMBYs, they're having a go at the planners themselves. The latest government thing is the statutory consultees. There's a whole new thing about statutory consultees. I think I'm just disappointed at the national scheme. I think councils are quite capable in most cases of doing it themselves.
Shelley, I'm going to bring you in a minute on PAS stuff, but I probably need to respond from a cuddly developer perspective.
Of course.
So I'm generally in favour of national scheme of delegation, and I've been arguing for that for a while. And I don't think wearing my previous local government hat, I'd necessarily have a concern about it. And actually, for me, there's a few key things. One, it's about consistency of process. We have a nationalised planning system in the country, and actually having that consistency of decision-making process across the country is quite logical, really. If, as Shelley said, 2/3, 70% roughly do the same process anyway, well, codifying that, having that set down a national scheme of delegation to bring everybody up to the same level wouldn't make much difference to some extent, but it brings everyone into line and it provides clarity. I think consistency on clarity of a decision-making process is quite important. If I submit a planning application, I should know the process that it's going to follow to reach a decision. I think that's the decision at the end is something slightly different, whether that's the actual outcome, but the process that it should go through, I think, should be relatively standard, and I should be able to know that going right at the start. I also, and I think this is really important when we talk about capacity within local government, it takes far longer from an officer perspective to get applications to committee, and committee time should, in my view, be focused on those core large-scale applications. I've had so many neighbour extensions going to committee in the past, but based on call-ins or funny things, because it's easier for councillors to some extent to say, oh yes, I'll call it into committee, and that placates some of the discussion. So really focusing on that strategic nature of applications, I think, is important from a planning perspective, but then it frees up officer time to focus on those core things. And I'm going to start to take issue with Mike. I'm really not sure about the chair role in terms of deciding whether something should go or not. It's that if it's significant to go, it should be based on those planning merits, which are, should be easy to sort of to set down with a scheme of delegation rather than and I've done it before, but you phone up as a chief officer, you phone up the committee chair. What do you think about this? I don't think we should go. What do you think? And you have that sort of debate about it. I think it should be relatively clear cut. But anyway, Shelley, quick view, and then we're going to move on to strategic committees.
Yeah, well, I mean, reading the PIB yesterday, there's definitely provisions in there for a national scheme of delegation to be brought in. So I think the devil will be in the detail, as with all things. I mean, the study that we've run found that around 70% of authorities have got a delegation rate of over 96 or around 95, 96. So only the top 5 to 4% of applications are going before committee in quite a large number of councils. So there's potential that a national scheme of delegation will result with more things going to committee, or potentially further reducing that. So it's really only the top 1 or 2% of applications going to committee. So it will be a kind of wait and see. There's going to be consultation on it. So I think that will be the opportunity for the local government voice around the impacts to come forward to be. But yeah, I think in terms of delegation, that consistency point I can understand as well. I can see that there are, having read lots of schemes of delegation, there are substantive kind of variances up and down the country. So yeah, I think it will be a balance between that consistency point and making sure that planning committees are still being that really essential democratic scrutiny of the most important, the most complex, the most controversial applications. Because planning committee does play a crucial role in the planning system. I don't agree with the perspective that we should take the politics out of planning. I think actually that non-officer scrutiny is really, really important to have in our planning system.
Andrew, could I just come back briefly on that chair as the gatekeeper role? I have worked in authorities that operate that, and it does work really, really well. Trying to codify, yes, you can codify that it's a big application. Yes, you can define what is a legitimate objection. But the rest is actually quite hard to do when you try and nail it down. And what I've found is that in the various, I do quite a lot of work in terms of rewriting constitutions and working with committees. And the councils who have that gatekeeping role of the chair and the chief planning officer, well, it works really, really well. So it's just a slightly different approach, but there you go.
Let's talk about strategic committees for a few minutes. So proposal for, certainly when we have, combined authorities or have a strategic committee that will take some of those broader than local decisions and allow the local committee, if that's the right phrase, to take some of the more standard large scale applications. But Mike, thinking about GLA experience, I mean, how do some of these things work and the benefits of it?
Well, I think it is important to have a separate committee or at least a separate part of the main committee dealing with the strategic development. Because for me, members, if you like, have two roles in committee. When they're dealing with the householder objections that get called in or however they end up at committee, are neighbourhood dispute mediators. And they're the worst people in the world. Politicians are the worst people in the world to be neighbourhood dispute mediators because it's a zero-sum game for them. And when I've discussed it with members, they're quite happy actually to get less of that stuff because it just causes them a load of angst. If they go with the applicant, the neighbours, the objectors are upset and vice versa. When they're dealing with the big stuff, I want them to have their, if you like, strategic placemaking head on them. And I don't want that to be polluted by the neighbourhood dispute mediator role insofar as I can. So I always either have a separate committee or the strategic stuff get dealt with first before the mob rule sort of takes over. If we are moving to a situation where it's only larger applications, however government ends up defining it, the point is moot. The committees will be strategic committees dealing with strategic applications. I would make one more point. I mean, depending on how local government sort of restructures pan out, how the planning system operates in detail, particularly the DM part of it, in that new two-tier sort of system with a strategic authority producing a strategic plan and other much larger authorities dealing with DM. I think if councils are just dealing with strategic matters at committee, where you have a local planning authority that just deals with strategic matters at the moment, the GLA, the executive takes those decisions. The mayor or whoever he delegates it to takes those decisions. So I think that's a question we need to ask. If we are putting only strategic planning matters to politicians for decision, is planning committee the right place, or should it be the mayor, cabinet, or, depending on the model that councils have? I think it's a legitimate question that we need to consider, because if this is about delivering, your job as a planning decision maker under Section 38(6) is to deliver the plan. That's your job. Not to fight against it, not to say you disagree with it. If you disagree with it, you shouldn't be taking planning decisions. Your job is to deliver the plan. You must make your decision in line with the plan unless there's good planning reasons not to. Should that be the executive who are looking to deliver change in their area rather than a politically balanced planning committee? So I think there's a debate, an issue there that raised by this and by local government reorganisation that we need to have a debate about.
That's an entire podcast by itself, isn't it? Adele, can I come to you about mandatory training? We've got a shift topic now, mandatory training for councillors. So it's got to be good, hasn't it, that councillors know what they're talking about when they sit on a committee? You do a lot of training?
100%. And actually, I was quite shocked to find that anybody is allowed to sit on a planning committee without having had any training. I mean, it's not something that I've experienced personally, with the authority I was with. So I find that quite shocking. So yes, absolutely, mandatory training. And I think it should be mandatory annually as well. And I think it should be all committee members that have to do it. Quite often, you get trained at the first the beginning of your 4-year cycle, and then anybody who kind of pops in and out of the committee along the way, as they do according to group appointments, gets trained. But they don't always retrain the person who's had it at the start. So I think it should be, I think, annual, mandatory. And I also think it should be open, all of those training sessions. You should invite any councillor that wants to come and watch it. And the planners who are going, particularly anybody who is likely to be presenting to planning committee, case officers or whatever, and your legal representative. So I think it's useful to have all of those people in the room so that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet, basically. I think in person as well is better. I think you can do it online, but it's got to be some kind of interactive online session where questioning is possible. And I think, but I'm biased, and Mike's probably biased as well. It should be delivered by external trainers, and I think councillors accept it better somehow from external trainers rather than from their own offices.
You can be blunter a little bit, can't you? You can sort of poke them a bit, whereas the officers got to not be deference, but maintain that relationship.
Can I just pick up that point, Andrew, on whether it's external or not? Because 25 years ago, following the Nolan review, I had to put in place training for the first time in the council where I was. And I thought I was, 25 years ago, fairly sort of new as a lead officer. I thought, I can't be telling members what to do. So I got in an external guy. And there was nothing wrong with him, but he just didn't gel with the committee. So, that's by the by. The next year I thought, I'll do it. And what I think training gives your chief planner the opportunity is team building with their planning committee. It's about working together, respecting each other's roles, having a full and frank discussion about that, and working as a team. And you can develop what I call the choreography of planning committee, where members say things in a certain way and I know what they mean, and I say things in a certain way and they know what I mean. And it is about working together as a team. So I think it will. I'm not saying you don't have external people doing it, but I think you miss a key opportunity to build a relationship and work with your committee so that it functions constructively, efficiently and well.
So one of the interesting issues, I'm going to bring Shelly in here, which goes slightly to the point that Mike's just made, is about actually certification. It says that members will need to have a certificate and waive it, and how you do that with an internal, external, what's the course and others. But Shelly, come in on that point.
Yeah, so I mean, there's pros and cons to internal, external training providers and members, and I think it very much depends on that trust relationship between members and officers, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. I think actually a mixture of both is great, but yeah, picking up on what the PIB says, so it gives, I mean, it gives government quite broad powers to introduce a sort of national certification system. It gives them powers to appoint the person or organisation that's going to deliver that training, or range of organisations to deliver that training. There are lots of really great external providers out there, just as well as PAS. But then its authorities have got to keep up an updated published list of which councillors have completed that training. And that applies to mayors as well. So picking up on Mike's point around actually mayoral teams are going to have this requirement as well. So it's going to be a bit of work for councils as well to make sure that everybody's trained, or certificates are kind of transparently publicised on a web page somewhere. But I suppose my endearing point is, I don't have a strong view whether it's internal, external, whether it's online, in person. The key thing is it giving members the skills, knowledge and confidence to be effective decision makers? Like the impact, the output, that's the key thing. So it's not endemic. I think it is, it's a smaller problem than maybe the noise around planning committees is leading us to believe.
I just wanted to come in on the certification bit, because how is that going to be assessed? You've attended the training and you get a certificate at the end of it, but in some authorities, I mean, we've gone back to authorities that we've previously trained or watched online their committees, and you can see that some people haven't changed at all. I mean, that is life. That is the nature of humans, is that some people can do training and they'll learn from it, and some people can do training and they won't learn or they won't change their behaviours. So I'm not even sure that having the certificate is the be all and end all, to be honest, to prove that they've done the training. What I want to see is the proof that they've done the training is in their behaviours afterwards.
Talking about changing approaches and behaviours, committees online, or use of technology in committee, I'd be interested in, Shelley, in terms of good practice from during the pandemic, and what sort of the proposals might be now, and what we think about them.
Yeah, so I think definitely when the pandemic hit and we were all forced into running planning committees online, there was definitely elements of best practice. I think around the transparency of voting was the core one. So literally the chair of a committee or the Democratic Services Officer having to go to each councillor individually on their little square and say, and how are you voting? And it was really easy as a kind of external viewer to get that transparency of decision making. Do I think that long-term online committees are good for planning committee? I'm not so sure. I think planning committee is the shop window of any council, and it needs to be held in the highest level of transparency and probity. And I think actually being online allows some wiggle room for a kind of lack of transparency. So there's pros and cons, I think, to both, but I'm not sure that planning committee is a good fit for kind of online meetings on the whole.
I suppose one of the potential benefits is allow more people to watch. So the committee is in person in the chamber or wherever, but the video casting or the ability for public speaking, if they can't get to the meeting, they could potentially video call in or whatever it is. But you have that, there's a flexibility around that, but the decision makers and the core officers are sort of sitting together and can see each other, but actually it broadens out to a broader audience, I suppose. Is that the two halfway house?
Definitely. And, we asked questions in the survey around, do councils kind of webcast their meetings? And 85% said that they do. It's only a really small, like 15% said that they don't webcast or make the recordings available. And most members are now receiving their agenda papers in a digital format. It's only really like 1% still get them hard copy only. Some get both. But yeah, I think definitely that webcasting ability has made planning committee a more accessible meeting for stakeholders and members of the public, and geeks like me that like to watch a couple a week while making tea.
Well, I zoomed into one of the public inquiries yesterday and just had a little look, and leaving aside the structure of the room and whether it was appropriate for holding a complicated, it was really interesting to be able to see things happening and actually see that democratic process. Or this was an inquiry, but look at that process happening in reality. Go on, Mike, quickly.
Just a couple of points on remote committees. I completely agree with Shelley. I think committees should normally be in person, and the decision makers and officers should normally be in attendance. By all means, use that technology to allow people to attend who can't make it for good reasons, and I think that should include the decision makers. So the expectation is that they should be there, but if they can't for whatever reason. But I think there are a couple of issues that are raised by that. So the rules are in committee. You must be in attendance for the whole of the item, and you mustn't communicate with other people for the whole of the item. So people who are in attendance, decision makers, committee members, must have their cameras on and must be there the whole time. If they go, then they've left the room and they can't vote, because those are the rules in committee. And so you must apply that same criteria. They must be present and they mustn't be communicated with. And the second one is a little bit more difficult, but it's difficult in committee with people with phones and getting text messages. But we've got to ensure that we got a level playing field across all media.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Andrew, Shelley, Mike, and Adele for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning and local government reorganisation, CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value, infrastructure planning, development and nature restoration, grey belt, statutory consultees, design and placemaking, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.